You're listening to the Hour of the Time. I'm William Cooper. Make sure you're paying attention as we continue with our report entitled The Ugly Truth About the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, by the editors of the Executive Intelligence Review. Gangsters and traitors from the start, ladies and gentlemen. The ADL had been founded shortly after the turn of the century as a Jewish defense arm of the B'nai B'rith. At least that's what the Jews were told. The nominally Jewish secret society which is sponsored and controlled in all actuality by the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry and by some of the leading British and American families who are not Jewish at all, but subscribe to the British Israelite philosophy. B'nai B'rith, Washington, D.C. Representative Simon Wolfe, the man whom Lincoln's Secret Service chief Lafayette C. Baker had arrested as a Confederate spy and Union blockade runner during the Civil War, is now working closely with President Theodore Roosevelt in mobilizing Jewish American support for the overthrow of the Russian Tsar. According to Wolfe's 1918 autobiography, he had met secretly with President Roosevelt in his Sagamore Hills estate in New York and had launched an international drive to brand the Tsarist regime as, quote, anti-Semitic, end quote. They've done the same thing to me, ladies and gentlemen, as you all know. After a series of meetings and correspondence with Russia's Prime Minister, Count Sergei Witt, arranged by Roosevelt, Wolfe had denounced the Russian regime for reneging on its promises to curb anti-Jewish pogroms, after which American Jewish organizations led from behind the scenes by the B'nai B'rith began funneling guns to the anti-Tsarist insurrectionists. Thus, B'nai B'rith played an active role in the Russian Revolution of 1905. This activity, ladies and gentlemen, would lead to widespread allegations that prominent American Jews were pro-Bolshevik. The Warburg family of Kuhn, Loeb and Company did, in fact, fund V.I. Lenin and Leon Trotsky, and father and son Bolshevik agents Julius and Armand Hammer, who helped found the U.S. Communist Party, did actively spread the Bolshevik cause in America and spent a decade in the Soviet Union following the 1917 revolution. These allegations of pro-communist sentiments, while grounded in well-publicized and scandalous actions by prominent Jewish families, actually missed the mark. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, the plot to bring down the Tsar and install the Bolsheviks in power in Russia served long-standing British imperial and geopolitical interests of the sort advanced by the Scottish Rite and the Illuminati. Britain, in fact, feared the development of a Eurasian alliance among France, Germany, Russia, Japan, and China based on economic cooperation and facilitated by the building of a transcontinental system of railroads linking the East to the West. Such a transcontinental railroad system would render Britain's domination over the seas relatively unimportant. B'nai B'rith joined in the effort to sink the Tsar for the same reasons the Order joined in the Confederate secessionist plot to destroy the Union 40 years earlier, because B'nai B'rith was an arm of the Illuminati, Freemasonic treason, and still is. In fact, one of the most compelling reasons for the hatred of Russia was the role played by Tsar Alexander II in coming to the aid of Abraham Lincoln during the darkest days of the United States Civil War. In 1863, Tsar Alexander dispatched the powerful Russian Navy to the United States ports of New York and San Francisco and threatened to go to war against Britain if the Crown joined the war on the side of the Confederacy. This probably, without any public recognition whatsoever, is what eventually enabled the North to win the war, for Britain stayed out. They didn't want to stay out. They were forced to. At the same time, the so-called Jewish Bolshevik ties were being targeted, frequently by people with actual anti-Semitic biases. Diligent local police around the United States were becoming legitimately alarmed at the growing crime problem New York City Police Commissioner Theodore A. Bingham, in September 1908, penned an article for the prestigious North American Review titled, quote, "Foreign Criminals in New York," end quote. The article detailed the rise of gambling, prostitution, and drugs on New York's Lower East Side, emphasizing the role of Jewish, Italian, and Irish immigrant gangsters in that crime explosion. Bingham was not alone in his concern about the rise of gangsterism in the Jewish communities of the metropolitan New York area and beyond. You see, in April 1910, the leading Jewish families of the United States, Germany, France, and Great Britain sent delegates to a Jewish International Convention on the suppression of the traffic in girls and women in London. Keynote speaker Arthur R. Morrow delivered an alarming report on the involvement of Jewish gangsters in the worldwide white slave trade and in big-time prostitution. And for those of you who believe that this is all being brought about by the Jews, remember, these were the leading families, the leading Jewish families of the United States, Germany, France, and Great Britain, who sent delegates to a Jewish International Convention and brought the spotlight to this illegal and criminal traffic in girls and women. They were not guilty of participation. They, in fact, wanted it stopped. Quote, "I wish I had time to tell you all I know, which goes to show that the traffic of Jewesses is almost worldwide, but I must restrict myself to a few incidents to prove that an extensive traffic does exist. In 1901, a rabbi came from the Transvaal and told me that the amount of Jewish prostitution and traffic in Johannesburg, Pretoria, Lourenco, Marks, Beria, and Salisbury are appalling. In later years, the same story came from another rabbi regarding Cape Town. In 1903, a Jewish schoolmaster who had spent some time in Egypt said that the traffic by Jews of Jewesses to Alexandria, Cairo, and Port Said was an absolute scandal. There were Greek, Italian, and French prostitutes, but they were far outnumbered by the Jewesses. We have received and have correspondence to show that this awful condition of affairs exists in Calcutta to a large extent and also all along the free ports of China. From the chief rabbi of Constantinople, from a distinguished Jewish American scholar, from a prominent London gentleman, and from a schoolmistress in Calcutta, we have had letters during the past 6 months describing an outrageous condition of affairs in Constantinople where traffic in prostitutes is carried out openly and shamelessly, and where the traffickers have their own synagogue. They say things in Damascus are even worse." End quote. Already in 1909, the leading, quote, "our crowd," end quote, families of New York had established their own Bureau of Social Morals, headed by Rabbi Judah P. Magnes. The Bureau hired private detective Abe Schoenfeld, an investigator for John D. Rockefeller, Jr., to infiltrate and profile the organized crime structure centered on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Schoenfeld's mission was hardly that of crime buster, folks. In 1922, Rabbi Magnes took those voluminous files with him when he moved to Jerusalem and founded the Hebrew University. To this day, the genealogy chart of organized crime remains a part of the university's most closely guarded archives. It was during the same period of mounting concern over the exposure of Jewish surnamed gangsters that the Anti-Defamation League was founded, not to protect the Jewish people, but to protect the Jewish criminal element. One of the very first targets of the ADL was New York Police Commissioner Bingham, whom the ADL smeared as an anti-Semite for his efforts to quell organized crime on the Lower East Side. Bingham's crime-fighting efforts were by no means targeted exclusively against Jewish gangsters. His chief detective, Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino, was assassinated in March 1909 in Sicily while meeting with Italian police to establish cooperation in probing links between criminal elements and anarchist networks operating in both the United States and Italy. In 1901, Petrosino had warned the Secret Service about an imminent assassination attempt against President William McKinley. Petrosino had learned of the plot by infiltrating his agents into the Henry Street Settlement House in New York, a hotbed of British Fabian Society, and international anarchist activity. The Secret Service ignored his warnings, and McKinley was assassinated months later, leaving British agent and B'nai B'rith ally Teddy Roosevelt to assume the presidency. The nascent ADL, still formally called the Publicity Committee of the B'nai B'rith, had assailed Bingham's crime-fighting efforts for maligning Jews and eventually succeeded in having him ousted as police commissioner. Now remember, ladies and gentlemen, the ADL is not an arm of the Jewish community, but is an arm of a secret society, a branch of the Illuminati, known as B'nai B'rith, which is controlled by the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. Organized crime had a big boost as a result. What's more, the effort to establish the links between organized crime, international anarchist circles, and perhaps the Scottish Rite and B'nai B'rith secret society was stillborn. The man who founded and headed up the ADL for its first 30 years was Sigmund Livingston, a prominent Chicago attorney who had headed up the powerful B'nai B'rith Midwest Lodge No. 6. Livingston was the lawyer for the Chicago and Alton Railways, a company owned by William Moore of the prominent Episcopalian family. From the 1890s, the Moore family had forged a business alliance with the J.P. Morgan banking interests. The Moores, with Morgan Financing, founded the National Biscuit Company, now RJR Nabisco, and United States Steel Corporation. Within 2 generations, members of the Moore family would also control Bankers Trust Company and sit on the board of the International Business Machines Corporation that you know as IBM. The Moore family's sponsorship of Livingston, ADL chairman from 1913 to 1945, was a reflection of the underlying relationship between the leading WASP Freemasonic families and the ADL that continues through to the present. The Moore families, Nabisco, and United States Steel are on record today as major financial backers of the Anti-Defamation League. Ironically, Bishop Paul Moore of the same Moore family served for years as the Episcopal Bishop of New York. Based at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, he was the superior to Canon Edward West. Now remember, folks, what I told you about the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in the Mystery School series. Canon West's promise to get his Jewish friends to take care of Lyndon LaRouche provided crucial evidence that the real power behind the ADL and its organized crime confederates is the Scottish Rite. With the ADL's successful drive to oust New York Police Commissioner Bingham, organized crime began to spread its tentacles out into New York City and across the country. By the onset of Prohibition in 1920, the undisputed chief of the New York rackets was Arnold Rothstein, the son of a prominent garment manufacturer and a junior member of the elite, quote, Our Crowd, end quote. Many of the Our Crowd families, like the Lehmans, had come to New York from the South in the post-Civil War period. They were transplanted Confederates who capitalized on the power of the British Rothschild family's Wall Street representative August Belmont to quickly establish themselves among the city's leading bankers and stockbrokers. They had participated in the unsuccessful Confederate secessionist plot against the Union. Now they would take a leading role in the British effort to direct a new opium war against the American people. Rothstein, ladies and gentlemen, operated a gambling and prostitution syndicate out of the Metropole Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, far from the teeming ethnic ghetto of the Lower East Side. He ran the unofficial gambling commission for Tammany Hall boss Timothy Sullivan. He hobnobbed with some of the country's wealthiest legitimate businessmen, like Julius Fleischmann, the yeast manufacturer, Joseph Seagram, the Canadian distiller, Harry Sinclair of the Sinclair Oil Company, and Percival H. Hill, head of the American Tobacco Company. In 1919, Rothstein engineered the fixing of the Baseball World Series on behalf of his gambling cronies in what became known as the Chicago Black Sox scandal.